The bright hand of a girl from a street advertisement burst into the starry space. After greeting the audience, she presented her innovative product to them. The device for immersion in the virtual world real play, briefly called Reapple, promised to change the existing reality forever. Are they still content with boring multiplayer online role-playing games on their phones? Or primitive computer simulators that lack a sense of reality and don't even hint at authentic sensations? How much longer will they torment themselves with long-distance relationships where video calls are the only form of communication? But the solution to all their problems is already in Reapple, where they will find everything from dizzying games to real communication. A voice from the screen addressed to all passers-by on the street enticed them to try a new product and feel like the main character in a fantasy world. Do viewers want to visit a magical universe where absolutely any unimaginable miracle is possible? Real Play or Reapple embodies virtual reality, in which everything feels as vivid as in real life. How do they like this enchanting virtual world of Reapple? Do they want to see Red Pink Rose? An image of a beautiful smiling girl appeared on the screen. She winked at passers-by, sending air hearts to everyone and inviting them to meet her in the virtual world of Reapple. This colorful advertisement played continuously on the huge screens on the facade of the corner building that housed the shopping center. A schoolboy named Chang Hyun-soo walked indifferently past them as he made his way to school, past the Samsung Digital Plaza Service Center. He was an ordinary Korean teenager who had recently transferred to high school. He was thinking about how much the world had changed 2 years ago since the moment virtual reality Reapple appeared. Now it was a generation in which all people, regardless of gender and age, played it even while sitting at a table in a cafe. If you think about it, he was probably not as ordinary a person as he might seem at first glance. This becomes clear when you consider his relationship to Reapple, which had become an incredibly popular game during this period. At the school where high school student Chang Hyun-soo studied, the atmosphere was exactly the same as everywhere else. During breaks, everyone hung out in Reapple, heatedly discussing which option was better to choose. They talked to their friends on the phone, approving something and expressing their emotions with laughter emoticons. For example, a student asked her friend if she had seen the ad on the forums, because everyone was talking about Red Pink Rose, and she called the heroine in question a beauty. One classmate assured that yesterday in the fighting game, coercion rose to gold, while another believed that everyone was choosing the hell, where the third had reached the 20th level. However, the second boasted that he had reached the 38th level, and that his neighbor was a noob compared to him. The latter was very surprised because he saw that even YouTubers couldn't reach such a high level, but he expected his friend Kim Dong-hyun to stand out. Announcing that no one had yet reached a higher level, the leader asked if his interlocutors recognized him as number one, and they agreed with him. Turning his gaze to the door, the satisfied winner immediately noticed Chang Hyun-soo entering the room. He immediately announced loudly to his classmates that the guy who was considered an outcast had come to class. All the students who heard this remark instantly turned their gaze to the guy who had entered. However, he calmly walked to his seat, paying no attention to anyone. One of the girls asked if Chang Hyun-soo had eaten today, and another offered to buy him something to eat. Without answering, the student noisily pulled out a chair and sat down silently. The first girl who had asked him suggested not to bother him, fearing that he would get angry. The second agreed, assuring her that he looked so angry when they talked about Reapple that it was scary to say a word, and as usual, it ruined the whole atmosphere in the classroom. The first confirmed that this was indeed the case, and that she found it very funny, while Chang Hyun-soo thought about his school nickname, Reapple Hater. The reason for the offensive nickname was his hatred for this game, which he was the only one who didn't play. His thoughts were interrupted by the question of whether he had eaten breakfast today. Coming up close, his classmate asked quietly, and the guy answered affirmatively, thinking that there were not only low-class people here. Then the well-wisher winked and suggested leaving the classroom to talk without prying eyes. They walked silently down the long school corridor and then climbed the stairs to the roof. There, the classmate gave Chang Hyun-soo a pie, calling his friend a strange and incomprehensible guy. He asked if the guy really didn't feel uncomfortable, and Chang Hyun-soo replied briefly that it didn't bother him much. Dong-hyun didn't understand why it was so necessary to hate Reapple so strongly and demonstratively. After all, being friends with classmates is one of the components of school life, and he offered to lend his profile if his classmate didn't have any money. Although Chang Hyun-soo flatly refused, Dong-hyun insisted, assuring him that he was too lazy to bother with it, but found the atmosphere around his friend very unpleasant. And since they had already started talking about it, Maybe it was worth trusting him just this once and simply trying to play. However, the Reaple hater had no intention of changing his mind, stating that he had already made up his mind at the beginning of high school. He turned away abruptly and walked from the roof into the classroom, making it clear that the conversation between them was over. After class, Chang Hyun-soo came home and, thinking about his life, didn't even notice when the paper cup from his eaten noodles fell to the floor. Glancing at the empty plastic bags, he realized that he was grateful to Dong-hyun for his concern, but he considered it pointless because his friend did not know the real reason why he hated Reple. Sitting at his computer, he went online and opened YouTube, which was completely filled with channels about this virtual reality. The news reported the release of another expansion for it, even more improved, and there were even signs of a new update. Even the forums were filled with topics about Reple, with new posts appearing all the time. At the top was an article titled, "Memories of Reple, the collapse of PCs and arcade games are fading away." It was published 3 days ago and had garnered 108,000 views since then. Still, all these facts did not change Chang Hyun-soo's opinion, and he continued to hate this reality. Wondering why the teenager felt this way, he looked at the computer console. Was it because he had no money and had to eat only instant noodles? Although his guess was not the correct answer to the question, it was more hot than cold, and he remembered that period in the past when he had to give up and stop dreaming about the future. On the show, the host introduced him as the star of the evening and an e-sportsman aiming to take first place in the world. As a teenage genius who climbed to second place in the rankings and an athlete who could boast the best instant responses, the showman asked a rhetorical question. Would the guy finally be able to take the throne of supremacy, introducing him to the audience under the nickname One Frame? His parents differed from other adults in that they praised him for his success in games and supported their son who dreamed of doing this. They became the driving force that made Chang Hyun-soo persevere despite the difficulties. But a few years later, his life turned into hell due to an accident in which both his parents tragically died. At the funeral, the boy looked at their photos in mourning frames and shed bitter tears. However, even during this incredibly difficult period for him, the child did not stop playing video games. He did this not only because he really enjoyed the process of playing. It seemed to him that his parents were always nearby, just as they had been in the happy times before. Although perhaps the child simply wanted to forget about the difficulties he had to overcome on his own. It is not known whether this was the case or not, but he spent a lot of time at the console, controlling characters with a joystick and buttons, and at some point he suddenly realized the games had become his real life. His passion led Chang Hyun-soo to participate in the finals of the World Computer Game Championship, where his opponent was a bespectacled man older than him. During the game, the commentator called the block by the contender for the title of champion, who went by the nickname Play, amazing. According to the showman, his opponent, One Frame, was noticeably confused by such actions. Celebrating his victory, the bespectacled player smirked maliciously, saying that his opponent was not a genius at all, and that this was obvious to him. Without hesitation, he sent his character into attack, but the young participant did not want to end the match so ingloriously. Seeing the swing of the hero fighting his woman, he ordered himself to pull himself together and concentrate on the current moment of the battle. His left hand moved the joystick while the fingers of his right hand focused and quickly pressed the buttons. The commentator announced that One Frame had reacted to the attack, dodging the blow and counterattacking with incredible skill. At the last moment, the participant avoided defeat and won, completely turning the situation in his favor. Let's congratulate the winner, who finally came out on top. He defeated the player Play, who unofficially held first place, and in the end, a Korean schoolboy became the champion in the official international tournament. He had a total of 32 wins and 2 losses, counting the results of the qualifying tournament. This genius, who rushed like a bright comet, took the throne with his nickname One Frame. Seeing their idol on the podium, the audience enthusiastically raised homemade posters. People greeted the winning esportsman with cheers and waves. After receiving his well-deserved glory, Chang Hyun-soo left the game hall clutching his award. Having achieved recognition from the entire gaming community, the teenager was truly happy. In the lobby, his teammates congratulated the champion, proud that he had taken first place in the world. At that moment, it seemed to him that the future would only bring positive things, and that new victories awaited him. But soon the guys were notified that the team was being disbanded, and that their contracts were being terminated unilaterally. The captain lamented that there was nothing they could do about it, because the team sponsoring the competition had changed its business direction. Malfi Master of Fight also stopped development of the next installment, shifting its focus to Reapple and developing a new game called Coercion. Not understanding what was going on, Chang Hyun-soo was outraged, but one of the guys thought that maybe it was for the best, since the popularity of console games was already fading. The second participant announced that he had received an offer to become a pro gamer at Reapple and had already signed a contract with them. It hurt the champion to hear this. Were even they leaving, and would the team they had achieved so much together disappear? Turning to Hyun-soo, the gamers asked what he would do personally, because as the winner he would probably be welcome everywhere. Deeply saddened, he frowned and asked if that was all they were capable of. But his teammate told him to face the truth and realize that their employers only pay lip service. So it's good that they won't be working with these stupid jerks anymore. But Chan Hyun-soo suddenly felt so much pain that he fell to his knees, and the guys jumped up to him, worried about his health. It seemed to him that he could no longer endure the trials that had fallen to his lot, but someone's voice calling his name brought the guy to his senses. Responding, the student saw Dong-yoon asking why he was still sitting in the classroom when the lessons were over and everyone had long since left. He was genuinely concerned that his classmate might be in pain. Realizing that he had dozed off, Chan Hyun-soo remembered that he had had that stupid dream again, which had given him a headache. Thinking that his friend looked unwell, Dong-hyun decided to walk him home, but he refused his help. Despite his objections, his friend insisted that he had business with him, so they would go together, and quickly left the classroom. Then Chan Hyun-soo hurried after him, wondering what such urgent business it could be. Accidentally bumping into a stranger walking towards him, he apologized on the go and, without stopping, strode on. The stranger turned and looked back in bewilderment at the rude and inattentive schoolboy. His companions asked if he was okay and who the jerk who bumped into him was. But the stranger was depressed even without the incident, and hung his head gloomily, unhappy that the boy had bumped into him. Chang Hyun-soo led his friend to the small 3-story house where he lived. Upon entering the apartment, his classmates immediately took off their shoes at the door, leaving only their socks on. Reproaching his friend for the mess, Dong-hyun recommended that he clean up, but he snapped back, demanding that he mind his own business. Turning away, he began to change, taking off his school uniform and pulling his tie down sharply. After taking it off, he asked his friend what business he had that required him to come to his home. Smiling, Dong-hyun happily announced that he had prepared a gift for his classmate. He really wanted him to think seriously about it again and consider his offer. With these words, he reached into his briefcase and rummaged around in it a little, as if looking for something. Then, in front of the astonished teenager, he pulled out some strange contraption. After pausing for a moment, he winked and declared that this was the very same Reapple. Surprised, Chang Hyun-soo silently stared at the small object, but for some reason he was not at all pleased with the gift. Lowering his head, he closed his eyes and said discontentedly that he had already told them not to bring him any nonsense. But Dong-hyun revealed his secret, saying that he was the legendary One Frame, a 14-year-old schoolboy who took first place in the fighting game Malfi, a genius who, in addition to this, became the winner in every other fighting game, which no one else in history had ever achieved. The press wrote that after a while, the champion retired and covered all traces of himself. This coincided with the moment when the creators stopped developing the existing game, and this new game was later released on the Reapple platform. And Dong-hyun believed that it was nothing else but coercion that made his friend so withdrawn. Hearing the name, Chang Hyun-soo realized that this was the new game the captain had talked about on the day they announced the dissolution of their team. However, he said with conviction that he did not become like this because of some computer game. Agreeing, his friend said that he could not name the exact reason, but not knowing his friend's past, he could only make such assumptions. Nevertheless, nothing would change if he only avoided reality and hid from it. Therefore, he suggested that his friend try playing just once without fear. Handing him the virtual reality device, he asked him to show him how it worked, and Chan Hyun-soo reluctantly agreed. After putting the helmet on his head, he attempted to connect to Reapple. The connection was successful, and he saw himself floating in outer space. A greeting sounded for the new player with the nickname User 981,715. Moving his hands, he thought that the street advertisement was telling the truth. The sensations really were like in reality. The teenager saw and felt his virtual hands just like real ones. To get used to the new world, he closed his eyes, trying to analyze the situation. and immediately felt joy spreading through him. Not understanding the reason for it, the boy opened his eyes and clenched his left hand, which he had previously used to control the joystick, into a fist. To understand what actions he could perform with it, he turned his palm toward himself and slowly unclenched his fingers. Immediately, a screen appeared in front of him with menu items, instructions about the game, terms of use, exit the game, and start training. The screen moved closer, and an invitation to start studying the beginner's guide sounded. A message appeared about the start of training after the beginner read the instructions. He was surprised by the item that allowed him to change his nickname after completing the training. This was great because he didn't want to use the nickname assigned by Repl, so he clicked the Start Training button. Stripes appeared at the top of the screen from which squares began to break away. Apparently, Chan Hyun-soo himself was a small black figure. Then he felt himself standing in some kind of stance on these light gray stripes. Someone's voice voiced the greeting that lit up for the new player in the game compulsion and announced the start of training. Then he warned about the formation of an avatar that was generated randomly and could also be changed after training. The outfit was unusual: black pants and a t-shirt complemented by a hooded cape resembling a bat with an uneven bottom edge. One eye had a glowing pupil, while the other seemed to be completely smeared with opaque soot. A mannequin appeared in front of him, which he was instructed to attack using basic techniques according to the instructions. It was said that during training, all users had the same physical abilities. To the right of the guy was a screen with a description of the combat tactics, and the robot had glowing balls at the joints between the abdomen and chest, and between the arms and torso. And Chang Hyun-soo began by practicing straight punches to the body with his hands, which were protected by special pads. Then he began to use his legs to master attacking techniques. After a powerful blow, the mannequin fell apart, and immediately a message appeared saying that the training was complete. The novice stopped and watched as the pieces scattered and fell to the floor. A message appeared about moving on to the final stage of training, when the fight with a real opponent begins. He had not yet recovered from the previous fight, and was rummaging through his feelings, trying to understand whether it was possible to experience fun from such a game. However, a sign lit up indicating the end of the opponent selection process. Then the invisible teacher introduced Chan Hyun-soo to the next guest. Appearing in the space, the stranger broke into a broad smile, saying that he had been waiting for this moment for so long. And he welcomes to the training hall a noob, not a newbie, with the nickname User 981,715. Smiling, he clarified, just in case, whether the guy was a second account of a pro. Surprised, the newbie asked again and then said that this was his only account. He asked about the chat that appeared behind his opponent's back, and looking back, the latter smiled indulgently. He explained that it was a regular game broadcast, similar to those on YouTube, and Chang Hyun-soo laughed briefly and relaxing said that now he understood. However, the opponent was puzzled as to why the guy was wearing such unusual clothes and asked again if he was really a newbie. Not understanding what was strange about his outfit, the teenager confirmed that this was his first time trying to play Repl. In the accompanying chat, messages began flying about the start of the spectacle and how long the noob would be able to last, and the opponent suggested starting. Throwing his right fist forward, he said top, but Chang Hyun-soo instinctively dodged to the side. Then the coach tried to kick him, saying he was aiming for the middle, but the student managed to block the attack and then jumped back sharply. Angered, he immediately took a fighting stance, defending himself with his arms bent at the elbows. However, leaning on his knee, the opponent shouted and swung his leg low to knock the novice off his feet, but he quickly jumped up, and as he landed, the coach took the pose of an angry bear, aiming to grab the nimble boy. He succeeded and clung tightly to the collar of User 981,715's cape. With a shout, he lunged with his right foot and jerked the boy into the air above his head, intending to throw him against the wall. Realizing what was happening, Chang Hyun-soo became alarmed, understanding that his opponent was too good at fighting and that such a situation had not been shown in training. If he did nothing, he would definitely crash into him now, and it would probably be very painful. However, he was not helpless, because the technique here was the same as in the fighting game Malfi, so he was able to block the attacking combination. The physical settings that the advertisers had been touting were built into his body and himself. Then the novice grabbed his opponent by the wrists, and the opponent continued his swing and threw him forward. Pushing off with his hands, Chang Hyun-soo crouched and somersaulted in the air, and before the astonished eyes of his opponent, he successfully landed on his feet without reaching the wall. Noticing the newcomer's fairly good reaction, he was somewhat confused. Could this kid really block everything? Chan Hyun-soo bent his arms at the elbows and moved his fingers in surprise, confirming in practice that the logic of the movements was similar to Malfi. The opponent said that it seemed to him that the guy was used to games of this type, and he replied that he had played a little before. Then the big guy wondered if he should name this video on YouTube as a lesson from a pro pretending to be a noob. In that case, he also needed to take this game more seriously. After praising the guy for his interesting play, he asked if he would be willing to compete with his opponent playing at full strength. Inspired by the praise, Chang Hyun-soo did not immediately take the words of the more experienced specialist seriously, but the latter already warned of a new attack with a shout and rushed forward without hesitation. User 981,715 thought that the big guy was talking nonsense if he considered this headlong rush to be the only complication. He didn't remember how it all ended because he woke up when the Reaple attached to his head beat. Then the high school student opened his eyes and saw that he was in his room and it was already night. He was lying on the floor fully clothed, covered with a blanket and with a pillow under his head. The virtual reality device was beeping, and the guy realized that it had run out of power, which meant he needed to connect it to a power source. Taking the Reaple off his head, Chan Hyun-soo wondered if he had had fun. He didn't remember everything very well, but it seemed like he had fought too recklessly. He read on the internet that his opponent was a third-rank player named Frieder, who was doing something bad with an additional account. Aiming to crush novice players, he broadcasted his victories, but this time, he lost to a dubious newcomer. Seeing the commotion in the chat, the girl realized that the broadcast of that battle had shaken the entire Reaple community, generating a huge number of responses in a short period of time. After that video, users became interested in the newcomer, the so-called user 981,715. Because of this incident, Chang Hyun-soo, who showed his remarkable talent, will one day write a new story in the world of Reaple. When the high school student came to school the next day, Dong-hyun called him out again and they talked on the roof. Admiring Reaple, his friend convinced the newcomer that it was really cool. When asked if it was true, he explained that his opponent was the famous high-ranking player number 3 in Coercion. But a mysterious newcomer in a black demonic robe appeared and won a swift victory over this celebrity. And how unusual this new player looks with his fiery eyes. With his arrogant smile and tousled strands of hair sticking out from under his hood, he became a fantastic topic of discussion for everyone. And Chang Hyun-soo wondered if his friend was talking about, and is everyone really discussing this? Dong-hyun confirmed that this was no joke. People rushed to find out who was hiding behind this nickname, and Chang Hyun-soo thought it was probably a good thing that his face was hidden by his hood. He said aloud that now he understood why he was receiving so many messages in the game. They were asking if he wanted to become a pro in some kind of FAMA or something like that, offering him to join it and so on. This remark caused concern for Dong-hyun, and he advised him to be careful, saying it was just so his friend would be aware. But in his opinion, it was better to avoid a place called Fafa TV. Hearing this name, Chang Hyun-soo asked why it was necessary to avoid Fafa TV in particular. It turned out that among the high school students called Fight or Fight, the so-called bullies gather and fight. At the same time sharing their ranks with each other through a streaming platform, they arrange matches among participants with the help of fight managers or sponsors. Upon reaching a certain rank, you can receive a large cash reward from the platform on an illegal gaming server. Seeing Hyun-soo's eyes light up at the mention of money, his friend advised him not to be tempted by money alone, because it's very dangerous there. It's better not to even think about it. And the newcomer Reaple said he understood, expressing his desire to return home soon, and his friend agreed with him. Engrossed in conversation, the classmates did not notice that a girl was watching them closely. After learning who user 981,715 was, she thought that his image in reality was very different from his image in the game. Overhearing the conversation between the two friends, she managed to find out the name of this mysterious noob, Rappel, who had blown up the chat rooms yesterday. It was a normal school day, and gradually all the classmates came to class. Since Chang Hyun-soo was on duty, he had to clean up the trash in the classroom. After class, he hurriedly said goodbye to his friend, saying that he was rushing to his part-time job, and his friend said that they would see each other later. Leaving school, the guy thought about how he had been struggling to make ends meet lately, and that one part-time job was not enough to cover all his expenses. It had gotten to the point where he was completely broke, couldn't take out a loan, and felt awkward asking his relatives for money. With these gloomy thoughts, he glanced at his phone balance as he walked and put it away. But at that moment, someone grabbed his shoulder tightly. Turning his head, the guy saw a stranger with a strong build and asked who he was. A high school student immediately approached from the other side and asked if it was him. The strong guy replied that it seemed so. He clearly had negative feelings toward Chang Hyun-soo, because after saying that he needed to take him somewhere, he called the guy an obscene word. The two strangers took their victim to a room in another building, where their leader, angered that the kid was looking away, kicked him in the stomach. Then he asked if he remembered him. It was Chun-won, whom Hyun-soo had accidentally bumped into with his shoulder. The aggressor's friend was happy that the kid had gotten what he deserved. Bent over in pain, the boy did not understand why these jerks had suddenly called him over, and they were standing next to two other victims. The strong guy who grabbed him said that the old school building was indeed a cool place, and the second stranger agreed, adding that old people didn't go there. Chang Hyun-soo was tormented by the question of why he had been brought there after school, and what the hell they were doing there. Was it just because he had slightly pushed one of them that time? If the collision was the reason, then these bastards were real trash. His offender, Chun-won, turned to the two nerds, called them wallets, and tapped on the table, repeating, "Attention!" He menacingly demanded that they prepare 5 bills by tomorrow. If they were late in bringing it, they would be beaten by Chun-chan. Did they understand him? The victims obediently nodded their heads. The guy in the baseball cap asked why the extortionist was so angry. His girlfriend thought it was because of the loss on Fafa TV. But Chun-won said that the bastard knew he would win. The girl asked if she could bet too, and her neighbor replied that she should bet, but she should trust him and not Chun-won, who had his hands up his ass. Chang Hyun-soo remembered that Dong-hyun had talked about Fafa TV, but it was unclear whether it was illegal or not, and it seemed that the rumors were slightly exaggerated. However, it turns out that his friend was right, and this place is a gathering spot for all kinds of scum like his tormentor. The guy in the baseball cap asked if Chang Hyun-soo could just beat him up in case this jerk complained, but Chun-won told his friend not to worry. He laughed loudly, saying that he wasn't recklessly tormenting anyone and that this kid didn't have a single family member. Hyun-soo didn't understand how the aggressor found out about this, but then he realized that the rumors about Reaple's hater were widely known. Looking back, Chun-won looked at the teenager irritably, called him an obscene name, and laughed. Then, fixating on the boy's expression, he jumped up to him, called him names, and demanded that he make a simpler face if he didn't want to die. The boy lowered his head, but the aggressor did not let up, and frowning, repeated his demand. Then Chang Hyun-soo closed his eyes and clearly called Chun-won a bastard. At that very moment, a girl was walking down the corridor of the empty building. Attracted by the loud shouts and curses, she looked through the glass part of the wall into the room where the participants in the conflict were. She saw Chun-won swing for another blow, suggesting that he try that expression again and resenting the kid for staring. The girl said it was too noisy and that someone seemed to be coming, but the guy in the baseball cap reassured her, saying he would deal with the passerby. Assessing the situation, the stranger approached the door to the room and demanded from the doorway that they take it easy. Everyone present immediately turned their attention to her. Chun-won, who had previously grabbed Chang Hyun-soo's clothes with one hand and continued to hold them, turned around and asked who she was and what she had said. The stranger remarked that they apparently had nothing better to do, and wondered if they were now engaged in trashy activities in the old school. Jumping up to her, the guy in the baseball cap stepped on the toe of her sneakers and cursed, asking if she really didn't understand the situation. She should call the old men instead of standing there or wanting to play with them instead of the beaten boy. But the stranger looked him defiantly in the eye and advised him to remove his foot if he wanted to live. But he grinned and said he was afraid, so he didn't want to do that. Amazed by her behavior, Chun-won was confused by the girl's greenish hair and tried to remember where he might have seen her before. Could she be the high-ranking player from Fafa TV, the so-called Irin? After his guess dawned on him, the leader of the gang let Chang Hyun-soo go and rushed towards his accomplice, shouting at him to wait. But he didn't listen, and stumbling upon the fist of his confident opponent, collapsed to the floor, his baseball cap flying off his head. Frowning, Chun-won froze. The girl from the gang fearfully clasped her hands to her face, and Chang Hyun-soo opened his eyes wide, not understanding what had happened. The attacker fell at her feet, asking why she was so angry, and the fighter relaxed her fist and called him a weak bastard. Coughing, Hee-jae grabbed his bruised mouth with his palm and continued to lie down. Irin stood silently, slowly massaging her bruised arm. Then she turned toward the door, but for some reason did not leave, turning her head toward Chun-won. It was as if they were competing to see who would look away first and blink, but it turned out that the danger did not come from him. Another accomplice was outraged that the guest had hit a man and even said something, and the leader tried in vain to stop him. And she, asking if her interlocutor was deaf, again called the fallen man a weak bastard. Byung-yong flew into a rage and rushed at her with his fists, calling her obscene names. Watching her, Chung Hyun-soo decided that if she was creating such a situation herself, she was probably deliberately provoking the enemy. As the strong man approached, Iron turned sharply on her foot, deflecting her body from the line of attack, and the guy flew forward by inertia and almost fell. The beaten boy guessed that the warrior would most likely provoke another attack. And he was right. The girl first deflected the blow to the left, then to the right, provoking her opponent to swing his fists even harder to finally reach her with his hand. And then Byung-yong, burning with rage, swung his fist, intending to deliver the decisive blow. The girl stood motionless, keeping her hands in her pockets, and he thought that now his fist would definitely hit its target. However, this move was also provoked, and Irin was waiting for him. At that moment, she quickly raised her leg and kicked her opponent right in the face. Since everything was planned, of course, a counterattack was delivered. The situation immediately changed, and it all reminded Chung Hyun-soo of a game. At the decisive moment, the fighter instantly pulled her hands out of her pockets and began to use them for balance. Having dealt with the second opponent, she waited for the third to join the fight, but he behaved completely differently, and Irin asked what he was doing. Her question came when Byung-yeon lost his balance and flew into the wall, hitting it with his head. Standing on all fours, Hee-jae tried to get up but gasped helplessly, and the fighter hid her hands in her pockets again. But Chun-won didn't seem to want to fight. Instead, he laughed loudly. Then he said that the rumors about the player from Fafa TV were true, and calling her by her nickname, asked how she was doing. Irin calmly replied that it was noisy, and suggested that they quickly pick up their guys and get out of there. All four hurried to take her advice and walked down the corridor, Byung-yeon leaning on Chun-won and Hee-jae on a girl from his gang. The player from Fafa TV asked Chung Hyun-soo if he was okay, and although he answered in the affirmative, she asked him to come closer so she could examine him. Rubbing ointment on his face, Irin said that he wasn't badly hurt, which was good. But it would be better if he took the ointment and applied it to the sore spots regularly, and the boy thanked her for the bottle. Then she answered a phone call, confirming that she had checked on the two people the caller had mentioned. He asked about the results, whether they could be considered their people, and she replied that looking at their pitiful appearance, she would be against it. The caller thought this was bad, reminding her that the placement exam was coming up soon and they should hurry, and she agreed. Then, learning that her partner had some free time, she asked him to keep an eye on someone. Watching Chung Hyun-soo, she saw that he had gone to the computer club for a part-time job. The spacious room was filled with rows of personal computers, and the workstations were separated by transparent partitions. Glancing at his watch, the teenager quickly went to the back room and took off his school uniform, lamenting that he was almost late for his part-time job. But who could have known that he would have to deal with bullies? So he put on his company uniform. He couldn't get the image of the girl who saved him out of his head. One of his detractors seemed to say that she was from Fafa TV or whatever that organization is called. Standing in front of the mirror, he touched his bruised face with his hand and tried to understand why she had helped him. But his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a voice ordering the guy to get out quickly. He immediately responded and, leaving the back room, immediately picked up a tray with prepared food. He was ordered to clear the second and third tables, and the teenager replied that he would. He had not yet brought the dish to the customer sitting at the computer when he was called to pick up the finished ramen. When Hyun-soo approached the kitchen, a club employee said that table 20 was calling him. The guy asked again, not understanding why he should go there. The girl replied discontentedly that he couldn't make ramen like that and that there were complaints, and ordered him to hurry up before the boss found out. The boy rushed to workstation number 20, and approaching it, apologized and asked if he had been called. A young man wearing a baseball cap pulled down over his eyes was sitting there, but he did not answer the question. Hyun-soo apologized again and patiently asked if he had been called, but the visitor remained silent, so the boy asked directly if he really didn't like the ramen. However, the young man didn't even move, so Hyun-soo politely asked if that was the case. Then the young man turned around and said that the ramen was very, very delicious. And when the boy looked surprised, he said that he just wanted to compliment it. The discouraged boy went back, not understanding what had happened and what kind of strange person he had been talking to. The employee who had sent him asked how the conversation with the visitor had ended, and the boy hesitated at first. Then he reported that the customer had really liked the ramen, and the customer, looking Hyun-soo up and down, banged his fist on the table in annoyance. He grabbed his head in despair, considering it a complete failure. After all, He had come to see the candidate because Irin had asked him to, but how could such a young boy be hired by Fafa TV? But while the visitor was waiting for Hyunsu, he searched for him on the internet and saw that the boy had participated in a gaming tournament. He learned that the Korean fighting esportsman, with the nickname One Frame, had 8 victories in the Korean League of the fighting game Fight of Masters. His victory in the First World Championship League and 2 defeats are lost in the multitude of his victories. But after the sports club was liquidated, he disappeared without a trace. Thus the kid's dossier is truly impressive, but he himself is rather unremarkable. He has a personality far removed from fighting, and moreover, he apparently does not engage in sports. What is so special about this esportsman? He swore obscenely, pushed his chair back, bumped into his neighbor, and decided to let things be. Meanwhile, Chang Hyun-soo was already quite busy, noting how much work there was to do, because there were still those who played on the computer and not in repeal. 2 more people entered the club. Hee-jae asked why they were playing computer games instead of repeal, but Byung-yeon said that sometimes it was interesting anyway. Passing by Hyun-soo, he noticed the customers entering out of the corner of his eye and automatically said, "Welcome." But when they saw a familiar face, they instantly recognized him and paused. Without giving the boy time to react, Byung-yeon grabbed him by the collar and pulled him toward him. He said maliciously that now they had met, it seemed they had something to talk about. Looking fearfully at the big guy, Chang Hyun-soo didn't understand why these bullies were here. The visitor from table 20 was already heading for the exit, not knowing what to do with Irin's protege, whom he wanted to at least offer a test. But seeing that he was not at all combative, he changed his mind and now wondered what to do. Taking out the form with the boy's photo, he again assessed his open and good-natured face. And then he threw the paper behind his back, deciding to simply write that this candidate had failed. But suddenly he noticed how one of the guys dragged Chan Hyun-soo to the exit, and a club employee demanded that they let her colleague go, threatening to call the police. But that didn't stop the big guy, and his friend laughed at the indignant girl, suggesting she mind her own business. The examiner was confused, trying to understand what was happening. Could it be that his ward had been grabbed by hooligans? Besides, these were the same teenagers that Irin had called unfit, and now the second one was holding back the girl who had rushed after her colleague. The observer was delighted with this unexpected turn of events. These guys would be suitable opponents for his test, so it would probably be fun. And he began to secretly watch the commotion. Pulling Chan Hyun-soo into the courtyard, Byung-yeon threw him against the wall, and after he screamed, cursed the guy with obscene language. The big guy blamed him for the fact that because of him, they were both beaten up by this Irin, or whatever her name was. So let the worthless boy prepare to go to the other world today, but Hee-jae asked him to wait. He decided to play the good guy, calling himself and Hyun-soo victims because it was Chun-won who beat him, not them, and they would put in a good word for him with Chun-won. And with these words, the bully approached Hyun-soo closely, convincing him that for this, he would have to give them 40% of his salary every day as a bribe. Byung-yeon liked this arrangement and agreed with his friend, calling him smart. Hearing this, the inspector was convinced that these 2 candidates were indeed trash, and that it was good that Irin did not take them. But Chang Hyun-soo considered the bribe to be nonsense because he had only accidentally bumped into Chun-won once, so why should he now have to put up with such treatment? Besides, once he started giving money to these scoundrels, they would soon demand even more. He declared that he would not give them anything. Hee was astonished and asked if the boy really wasn't going to obey them. He wanted to punch the disobedient boy right in the nose, but Chang Hyun-soo managed to turn his head and the fist hit his cheek. The aggressor was overcome with rage and stared indignantly at his opponent, wondering why the boy was not responding, as if deliberately ignoring him. The boy's heart was pounding with fear, but covering his face with his palm, he confidently said that he had no intention of giving them any money. Wanting to psychologically intimidate the teenager, Hee asked again threateningly, sincerely hoping to scare the young man and force him to obey. Summoning his courage, Chang Hyun-soo removed his hand from his face and, frowning, repeated louder that he had already said he did not want to give them anything. Then, with one blow, Hee-jae knocked the stubborn boy to the ground and began kicking him. With his back against the wall, the boy curled up into a ball. Protecting his chest and stomach with his legs and arms, the aggressor called him names between blows and forced him to answer whether the victim wanted to give him money. The hiding observer frowned, not understanding why the teenager who had answered so confidently had ultimately backed down so pitifully. If he didn't intervene, would something worse happen? Still, he decided to watch for now. Backing away, Hiei caught his breath and smiled. Could this worm really dare to behave so disrespectfully? Hyunsu sighed heavily, sat down near the wall with his back against it, and remained silent, his head bowed dejectedly. This behavior annoyed the extortionist, and grabbing the boy by the hair, he lifted his face, wondering if he understood the seriousness of the situation. However, contrary to the bully's expectations, Hyunsu again stubbornly refused to pay, causing a new fit of rage in the blackmailer, who roughly pushed the boy away with his foot. He then said he would give him 5 minutes to think about it, after which he demonstratively walked away. When the allotted time had elapsed, the extortionist said that the beaten boy's life would become more difficult if he clung to such pennies, and Byung-yeon confirmed this statement. He even laughed mockingly, commenting on the helplessness of the hero, who not only couldn't fight, but was also sitting there protesting. These sarcastic remarks only strengthened Hyunsu's resolve as he clenched his fists, because for him it wasn't small change, and he sank into deep thought. The bullies threatened that his life would become even more difficult, but did they really think that after the death of his parents, his life could get any worse? He decided it was better not to let them intimidate him with such threats, and began to get to his feet. Stunned by the insolent schoolboy's behavior, the two street bullies watched him intently, looking at each other in confusion. The inspector dialed the police and began to call for help before the conflict took a more dangerous turn. But the placement exam was coming up soon, so what should he do? Maybe he could look for participants somewhere else. Suddenly, the silence was broken by Byung-won's loud and prolonged laughter as he enjoyed the behavior of his future prey. As it turned out, the reason for his amusement was the child's unexpected decision to stand up, tense himself, and prepare to fight. Clenching his fists, he shouted angrily that he would never give them any money. In response, Hee-jae grinned, took off his jacket, and cursed Hyunsu, asking if he really thought he was a good guy, unlike Chun-won, even though he knew how to be angry. He told him to get ready to take a break from school for a while and ran ahead. A police officer answered the phone and asked what had happened, but the inspector interrupted the call because he suddenly became interested in watching. Hyunsu had never tried fighting in his life, but he still remembered how he did it in Reapel. And besides, everything in life was slower than in the game, so he might be able to do it, but when he got close, his opponent hit him in the jaw with his first punch. And without giving him time to recover, he immediately hit him in the head with his right hand. Then switching hands, he punched his opponent's unprotected stomach with his right fist. The guy managed to stay on his feet, calming himself down with the thought that the blow wasn't that strong. Seeing that Hee-jae swung his right hand again, he focused, preparing to defend himself. Leaning to the left, he tried to dodge the blow, but it grazed his right cheek, leaving an unpleasant sensation. Then another painful jab to the head followed, making Chang Hyun-soo realize that he was still not fighting the right way. However, he finally managed to dodge in the opposite direction of his opponent's attacking arm, and he realized that he needed to look at the direction of the attack and, seeing its trajectory, dodge it. When the jab missed, Hee-jae tried to swing like a sword, but Hyun-soo bent down and dove under the raised arm. You have to follow the pattern of actions that your opponent repeats every time, then you can try to turn the situation to your advantage. The bully mainly threw his arms forward alternately, first the right, then the left, helping himself with lunges, indignant that the kid was dodging. He understood that defense alone would not win the fight, but how could he turn the situation around so that it would turn out like it did with Irin that time? The boy remembered how she dodged to the right, then to the left, then turned and stepped back, and then Hee-jae lunged at him with a running start, shouting, "Go to hell!" But Hyun-soo crouched down and dodged the kick with a lunge to the left. The examiner remembered that the news had called the boy the most talented e-sportsman in the history of fighting games. An e-sportsman with the best reaction speed, and it seemed that one frame had gone on the offensive. Hee-jae hadn't even managed to put his foot down yet when a fist aimed at his heart came flying towards him. However, the bully was much more experienced in street fighting and managed to put his left forearm up. Then, with the same hand, he grabbed his opponent's wrist, indignant that he had the nerve to raise his hand against him. But the other man only gasped softly without softening his animalistic grin. This enraged Hai-yi, and he threw the insolent man in the uniform shirt back with a strong push. The man braced himself and slammed his shoulders into the wall, but immediately darted to the side to escape his opponent's leg. The hooligan jumped back to consider his next move. Chang Hyun-soo's last maneuver was completely spontaneous, as he had never actually fought before. Before he got up from his lunge, Kim Hee-jae wanted to throw a jab with his right, but he missed. He gasped in surprise, cursing loudly and marveling at how nimble the kid was. The The examiner agreed with this opinion, tired of watching the long series of dodges and mentally preparing his ward to finally strike. He was about to intervene but decided to wait a little longer because he realized that the rookie did have some skills, even though he didn't know the basic stance. He also saw that the moment had come when his foolish opponent was getting tired. He was drenched in sweat and began to take short breaks to rest. Byung-yong noticed this and teased his friend that his momentum was falling. Laughing loudly, he added that the kid seemed to be mocking him. He knew perfectly well that such words would greatly hurt his partner's pride. Chang Hyun-soo understood this and froze, waiting for the extortionist's reaction. But the latter, enraged, began to insult his opponent, calling him trash and a fucking orphan. His insults had a strange effect on the boy. His head suddenly spun, and he mentally cursed and panicked. The pain intensified, and Hyun-soo clutched his head with his hands, not understanding what was happening to him and why this feeling was bothering him again. Hee-jae, egged on by his insults, ran back into the attack. Neither his opponent's yelling nor his bent posture as an aggressor stopped him. With a shout of "Stop showing off," he delivered a straight punch to the head, putting all his strength into it. The examiner saw Hyun-soo turn his head, spread his arms, fall onto his back, and collapse as if he had been mowed down. He didn't even try to stay on his feet or regroup. It seemed the blow was too strong. But why did he suddenly stop dodging? Looking at Byung-yeon's motionless body, he wondered if the kid had accidentally kicked the bucket. His friend was sure that he hadn't, explaining that a person couldn't just pass away like that. However, if this little guy came to and got up, he would beat him up again. Hearing such prospects, the inspector thought that he had been wrong not to report it to the police that time. Alarmed that the defeated man was not getting up, Byung-yeon did not know what to do, but Hee-jae calmed him down, believing that the kid was pretending. Hyun-soo quickly came to and began to move his fingers. Byung-yeon, who was watching him, immediately noticed this movement and cried out in surprise. Responding to his exclamation, Hee-jae turned around and said, "I told you so." After such a heavy blow, this resilient guy was clearly fine and laughed. Byung-yeon said he agreed with his friend, and Hee-jae triumphantly walked towards his opponent, who was standing like a zombie with his back bent. The guy who had stood up tried to say something, and approaching him closely, the extortionist lifted his head, asking what he was muttering. Then with bloodied lips, Chang Hyun-soo quietly said that he was going to hit him. Squinting one eye contemptuously, the extortionist raised an eyebrow in surprise, asking who this deadbeat was going to beat. But it turned out that he had been wrong not to take his opponent seriously. The extortionist swung his arm and hit Hee-jae, who closed his eyes and barely managed to stay on his feet. Immediately after that, he received a kick, which made him scream at the top of his lungs. Not expecting such resistance, the extortionist was taken aback, but when he recovered, he cursed viciously. But this did not bother Hyun-soo in the least, who confidently declared that he would send his opponent to his ancestors, his eyes burning with devilish fire. However, the teenager was feeling very heavy at heart. He wanted to curl up into a ball and hide somewhere. It was as if another personality had burst out of him, taking away his headache and advising him to rest. Covering the injured part of his face with his hand, Hee-jae tried to analyze what had happened. He didn't want to believe that this jerk could hit so hard. He acted completely differently, as if he had become a different person. Had he really changed so much? But maybe he didn't expect this from himself either, because after relaxing and lowering his head, ready to take advantage of this, Hee-jae went on the attack. Chan Hyun-soo dodged his jab with his left hand, stepping back. He avoided the jab with his right hand by turning perpendicular to the line of attack and simultaneously thrusting his forearm forward, colliding with his enemy's face. Then, bending down, he dove under the left attacking arm and struck his opponent in the chin. Now he was in control of the situation, grinning maliciously as he looked at his beaten opponent. The latter remained silent, only gnashing his teeth viciously at the insolent brat. Trying to use his lower limbs, Chang Hyun-soo swung his right leg and kicked. Provoking his opponent, he ran his palm horizontally across his face. And when the opponent was distracted by these fingers, he punched him in the teeth with his other hand. Jumping back, Kim Hee-jae held his fists to his head. Looking at the boy in bewilderment and seeing his bent fingers, he asked what he was doing. It seemed that Hyun-soo was filled with sinister joy, experiencing a moment of release from his restrained emotions, and he suggested they play a game. Stunned, Hee-jae mentally cursed, not daring to call his opponent names out loud, wondering if he had gone mad. But the boy dropped to one knee, as if preparing to play an invisible instrument. Then he suddenly punched the high schooler right in the face. Since the extortionist had his hand near his face, He grabbed the other boy's hand and wrapped his fingers around. He said confidently that even if the worm was good at dodging, he couldn't escape punishment when he was caught like last time. Thanks to the difference in physical strength, he was sure to win. Clenching the boy's fist with one hand, he punched Hyun-soo in the face with the other. However, the boy turned his head to minimize the damage and arrogantly asked if he would really win. Spinning like a top without any visible effort, he pulled his fist out of its grip, forcing Hee-jae to recoil. Then, swinging his leg after making a full turn around the vertical axis, he struck him in the chin. The bully's head fell to one side and he cursed viciously. His eyes began to dance, and then for some reason there were 3 opponents. His legs suddenly weakened and buckled, and he fell to his knees, not understanding why this had happened. Seeing him fall, the observer asked himself the same question. Had his protege hit a vulnerable spot and knocked out his opponent? He knew that the advantage in a fight is usually determined by weight class, which means that a novice like Hyun-soo has a limit regardless of how he fights. This was one of the reasons why the bully did not suffer much damage during the first sudden attack. But even though the kid was a novice, he hit his opponent in the lower part of the chin, aiming precisely for that spot. Concerned that his partner was sitting in the same position, Byung-yong asked if he was okay and what was wrong with him. He did not answer, and the bully, calling Hyun-soo a bastard, began to threaten. It was unclear how this fight would have ended, but suddenly the siren of a patrol car wailed, and the voice of a club employee was heard explaining to the police officer that her colleague had been brought here. Then Byung-yong picked up his friend and dragged him away, saying that the cops had arrived and it was time to get out of there. The inspector thought that this was the first time he had seen such an exceptional case, which was probably why Irin had told him to keep an eye on this newcomer. He didn't want to believe it, but it seemed that the guy, who seemed harmless at first glance, had become a completely different person during the fight. Hearing the siren, he did not try to detain his enemies, but simply stood with his head bowed. However, after they left, he began to lean to one side and suddenly fainted. The inspector was not surprised by this, because the guy had been beaten so badly that it would have been abnormal if he had continued to stand. Coming out of his hiding place, the observer approached Chan Hyun-soo to take another look at him before giving his assessment. At first, this guy seemed like a complete zero to him, and even considering that they urgently needed participants, it did not occur to him to take a newbie. Someone like this, about whom there was practically no information. But in an emergency situation, he showed calm judgment. His unexpected attacks were both accurate and logical. He confirmed the quick reaction of the e-sportsman under the nickname One Frame. It was obvious that he was looking at a diamond in the rough with great value and high potential. Although there was something about him that bothered the observer, if you want to get a good gem, you have to be aware of the risks. After thinking it over, the examiner made a decision and said that Chang Hyun-soo had passed the selection. Then he released the test paper from his palm, adding that he would explain everything when the guy got up. When the paper landed, the observer welcomed the new participant to the world of Fafa TV. Thus, a new page in the life of this schoolboy was open, and the ruthless coach began by bringing his physical fitness up to an acceptable level. The training process began with the coach's command to start doing push-ups. Then came the command to start doing sit-ups, bending down to his bent legs. Then the high school student had to run 50 meters. After that, they approached the horizontal bar and had to do pull-ups. When the coach said good and stopped the new recruit, he was panting heavily. He stood bent over, resting, apparently deciding that it was all over for today. But the coach said that he still had to run 3 kilometers, and Hyun-soo was surprised that it wasn't over yet. The coach, his glasses glinting, said that when they were done with this, they would have to go somewhere and ordered him to run. While running, the boy cursed under his breath, thinking about how he'd ended up in this situation and wondering if he had rushed his decision. After yesterday's fight with Hee-jae, it turned out that he wasn't seriously injured, but because of her, Hyun-soo was absent from work and was fired from his part-time job. He had a lot of problems that needed to be solved immediately, and in a depressed mood, he left his employer. But on the way home, he met a visitor who had been at table number 20 in the computer club. Stopping the teenager, the stranger called his name and said he wanted to talk to him. He was not aggressive at all, winning him over with his politeness and formal address. It was this man who had approached him after the fight, and Hyun-soo frankly admitted that he had heard rumors about Fafa TV, but had not dared to share them. Then the stranger suggested that the boy did not seem to have reliable information. He explained everything in such an accessible way as if he had expected this question in advance. He did not talk about Fafa TV itself, but about a game called Coliseum, considering it a gathering of hooligans fighting to take over each district. But then an unpleasant situation arose when, due to the chaotic ranking system, areas of lawlessness formed. Then the only way to determine the skills of each fighter in Rappel was created, which was used to divide the ranks, and it was called Colosseum. But this turned into a regular game that distributed ranks, becoming a place for dogfights, and a single game path called Fa TV emerged. The stranger was looking for a participant who could join the fight there, and when he saw Hyunsu fighting, he became interested in him. Briefly outlining the situation, he asked the guy if he wanted to become such a fighter. Then the schoolboy honestly admitted that although he had fought today, it was the first time in his life, and therefore he was not sure of his abilities, but his interlocutor believed that the guy was interested. Then maybe One Frame would do what he wanted after all. Hearing his old nickname, Hyunsu realized that the man already knew who he was dealing with. It turned out that the man had heard that the boy didn't like Rappel but said that Fafa TV was completely different. After all, he himself knew how interesting it was to look for ways to defeat an opponent. However, Hyunsu replied that he didn't know because it was his first fight and he didn't have time for it. The stranger said that they give monthly allowances and generous dividends for victories. It's more than the usual salary from part-time jobs, but in return you can't give up halfway. After hearing these words, the schoolboy immediately agreed. He asked when he could start, his eyes shining with genuine interest. That's how they met, and now, after running 3 kilometers, he collapsed on the ground, breathing heavily. The coach announced that the newcomer had defeated them in 12 minutes and 57 seconds, but with such endurance, he would die immediately. The 20-year-old mentor's name was Lee Hyuk, and in the Coliseum, he had the status of a master of the underdog clan. Hyunsu said that he had given his all, and his coach agreed, adding that at least this guy could do well. Then the student politely asked if he could ask Mr. Lee Hyuk one question. Tom was uncomfortable with the formality, so he immediately suggested calling him by his first name without unnecessary formalities. Then he asked what interested his student, who wanted to know more about Fafa TV. Are clans connected to hooligans? Lee Hyuk replied that these are completely different things. They are completely different. His statement immediately raised a new question. Is there any point in maintaining his clan at all? It turned out that Fafa TV, which manages the Coliseum game, imposes a lot of fees on outsiders. There were a lot of them: an entrance fee, paid viewing, monthly subscription fees, and commissions. The amount surprised Hyunsu. He asked if it was possible not to pay for this if he became an esports player, but Lee Hyuk replied that esports players have completely different conditions. You can't just join and immediately register as an esports player. To enter Coliseum, you have to pay the fees and pass a game code test. To reach at least the basic rank, you need to pay more than 500,000 won. Hyunsu was saddened by this and considered it a big problem, because where would ordinary school children get that kind of money? It turned out that money issues were resolved by clan leaders such as Lee Hyuk, who hired people with good abilities. In this case, the clan received a stable income, and the esports player lived in good conditions and could focus on the game. The mentor smiled kindly and looked at the teenager attentively and with interest. The teenager wondered if this whole system could be called a real business. Getting up from the bench, Lee Hyuk said that this was not his goal, and that it was time to go. After a grueling workout, Hyunsu didn't feel like going anywhere, but the master reminded him that there was a lot to do today. To register the boy, they needed to get a code to enter the game and pass an entrance test. They also needed to introduce him to the members of their clan. First, for some reason, they went into a room where someone was practicing kicks on a punching bag. The intensity of the training could be judged by the beads of sweat dripping onto the floor. His triceps and deltoids were clearly visible on his bare arm, and his back muscles bulged under his tight-fitting top. It was Hyunsu's familiar friend, Irin. Seeing the master, the girl turned around and asked if it was the agreed time to go there. On the way, Lee Hyuk gave the newcomer a phone for personal use. They were walking to some place with cigarette butts on the asphalt where young people were hanging out. The young man laughed, calling something nonsense, and the girl next to him asked why. 3 girls were discussing this interlocutor. One of them called her cute and asked if she was in the middle grades. Seeing them passing by, one of the guys asked who this loser was, and his friend suggested that he had probably come to watch. When asked by Hyunsu if it was really necessary to come here, Lee Hyuk said not to complain, because the code for the Coliseum had to be obtained here. However, the newcomer let slip that he didn't even know such a place existed. The master explained that it used to be a place for gathering teams. Before the Colosseum was moved to Reapel, they used to do it at this site, and now even groups of friends can gather here. It became relatively quiet, and suddenly he saw the people he was looking for in the distance and waved to them, shouting that they were here. One of the men asked the other what the newcomer was doing there, and the second replied that he had seen him for the first time. The third person, wearing a mask that covered her face below the eyes, was a girl. Hyunsu was surprised to recognize her as Irin and immediately thought that she might also be a member of the clan. Confirming his assumption, the girl revealed her face, and it turned out that she was also from the Underdog clan and had a D rank. Reacting to Irin's movement, the man with the chain around his neck grinned and asked if she was the guy, but the second man said that this was the first time he had heard of it. When Lee Hyuk and Hyunsu approached, Irin reproached her brother for being late. Her companions were surprised to learn that she had a brother and began to scrutinize the new arrivals. The man with the chain guessed that the stranger who had called out to her was the master of the Underdog clan. His friend asked Hyunsu if the guy was in the clan, and he replied that he had recently joined, causing the questioner to feign surprise. The third stranger said that this was their pack, and everyone looked at him, and he, waiting for everyone's attention, suddenly burst out laughing. Then the man with the chain winked at Lee Hyuk and said aloud that this is what happens when no one wants to join the team. He said that he was simply shocked that they wanted to hire such nobodies, that he also found it funny, and that it was nonsense. But then he turned to Irin and said sarcastically that it wasn't nonsense at all. He quickly moved closer and gently hugged her from behind, saying that the reason was that she was a charming little sister with the maximum D rank. Outraged by his rudeness, the girl grabbed the cheeky man's finger, threatening to break it, and said that his mockery and sarcastic comments didn't matter to her. But she told him not to touch her body and pulled his hand away, while the man himself fearfully removed his other hand from her shoulder. Then he moved away and, rubbing his injured finger, cursed loudly, saying that they wouldn't even let him joke around. His friend told him it was time to leave. He agreed, saying over his shoulder that there was no coder today, so it was better to just leave. Lee Hyuk replied that he didn't believe it, but sincerely thanked his interlocutor for the useful information. And with the words that the slums were flourishing, the master, whom he knew well, went on his way. Irin didn't see anything funny in this, but the master philosophically remarked that there was nothing to be done. She was a high-ranking player, so she couldn't fight. The girl complained that this place was so stressful, but he patted her on the shoulder and suggested she be patient. They would get the code for Hyunsu and leave immediately. Turning to the new fighter, the warrior said that she asked him to love and cherish her. Smiling kindly, the young man replied that he asked the same of himself. Surprised, Irin asked why he said that, wondering if he was surprised that she was a member of the clan, and he admitted that he was a little puzzled. They came to some kind of platform near a building of unknown purpose, where unfamiliar people were sitting and standing. Here, Lee Hyuk asked her to wait while he talked for a moment, and Irin sighed, dissatisfied that the master had not found out everything in advance. Hyunsu asked if the code was really that important, and she was surprised that the master had not explained it to him. She handed him her phone, explaining that without the code, they couldn't download the base game or find out any internal information, so he asked about the test. The girl said that it was based on ability, and that the tester apparently did it at his own discretion. And Hyunsu guessed that it looked like they would have to fight again. He laughed, and Irin asked anxiously what was wrong, and the guy replied that the thought of going back had suddenly crossed his mind. Closing her eyes, she reassured the newcomer, saying that the master would probably put in a good word for him, but suddenly a warlike cry rang out nearby. Opening her eyes, the girl saw the attack of the same man with a chain around his neck who had previously grabbed her shoulders without permission. His blow was so sharp and sudden that Chang Hyun-soo lost his footing and flew several meters away from his opponent. The teenager fell, and onlookers quickly gathered around him, wanting to see what kind of fight had broken out on the playground. The offender headed towards the newcomer, forcing him to get up quickly, but suddenly someone grabbed him from behind by his clothes, forcing him to stop. With a face contorted with anger, Irina held him back and asked in a harsh voice if he understood what he was doing and why he was attacking her. But he turned around indifferently, shook off her hand, and asked her sternly not to interfere, urging the girl to calm down. Raising an eyebrow, the man explained that he hadn't introduced himself right away, but that he was the official tester. Stunned by his words, Irin fell silent, mentally indignant that this insolent jerk was the tester. At that moment, Lee Hyuk approached and said that the test had begun and that the tester was behaving like a hooligan, so he was a little worried. But it seemed to him that a newcomer of this level was quite capable of withstanding the fight and even obliged to defeat his strong opponent. When everyone finally understood what was going on, the man with the chain around his neck smiled and officially invited the newcomer to begin the real test. With irony in his voice, he asked if they were really asking for the code, and then mockingly asked the master underdog what kind of nonsense the old man was talking about. But Lee Hyuk calmly smiled in response and advised him not to be so pompous, because he had already found out everything in advance. Then, pursing his lips in offense, the tester declared that it would be better not to conduct the test on this useless person at all. After all, he would not be lenient and was going to beat him with all his fury, without mercy, and without making any concessions. However, Lee Hyuk was not at all frightened by his words, and easily joked that he was, of course, insanely afraid of threats. But his interlocutor was also deeply mistaken in his assessment of the situation and did not understand the balance of power in this battle. He asked directly why Yang Hak was so confident of victory and on what basis he believed he would definitely win. The tester frowned, and Master Underdog thought that he had probably angered him too much with his words. But the challenge had been issued, and Lee Hyuk set up an observation point for himself on a pile of broken containers, placing a tire on top of it. No sooner had he settled in comfortably than he caught Iron's puzzled gaze, clearly dissatisfied with his behavior at that moment. Her face clearly showed her irritation. She did not like the fight that had started suddenly and without warning. Then the clan leader smiled back at her, letting her know that there was no need to worry, that she would be able to see an interesting spectacle. When the crowd learned about the test, one of the onlookers quickly ran to his friends to share the exciting news about the fight. The girl coldly replied that such things happened almost every day in this place, so there was nothing to be surprised about. But the guy, choking with excitement, interrupted her and suggested that she just listen to who was fighting today. Anticipating questions from his friends, he rubbed his fist impatiently, as if he couldn't sit still in anticipation of what was about to happen. Seeing his undisguised excitement, the girl reluctantly asked who would be fighting, and the guy enthusiastically blurted out that it was the tester Oh Yang Hak. The 18-year-old tester studied at Taehyun High School. Posing in front of the audience, he lazily scratched the back of his head with one hand. The regulars perked up, flocking to the arena, saying they hadn't seen a test in a long time and laughing, wishing him to simply lose. However, a girl with a lip piercing advised him to win. But Yang Hak, annoyed by the noise, rudely advised the crowd to start betting and suck up the money. The cashier loudly called for bets, and a passerby asked his friend with a smirk who he was going to bet on. The latter laughed and said that he should bet on the newcomer, but could such a weakling really win? Hyun-soo didn't know what to do. Suddenly, he noticed his opponent's leg flying towards him, so he quickly began to dodge the unexpected blow. Cursing loudly, Yang Hak grumbled that the guy was allowing himself to be distracted in the middle of the fight, as if he didn't perceive the threat. After that, he sharply continued to attack with his feet, trying to get his opponent in any way possible. Chang Hyun-soo dodged the blows, but the man, grinning maliciously, did not stop swinging them. Despite the various techniques used against him, the novice managed to dodge, and the tester froze for a moment, pursing his lips. Irin was also surprised, wondering how the guy managed to remain unharmed for so long. The audience began to marvel as well, because no one expected this protracted duel to be so stubborn. Yang Hak tilted his head slightly and admitted that the dummy was dodging well, but he was already exhausted. Analyzing Hyun-soo's movements, Irin thought they were similar to those she had seen in Compulsion. He dodged with tremendous speed as soon as he saw a threat. But this tester was different from the usual local clumsy hooligans, and the girl realized that he definitely had something prepared in advance. Meanwhile, the spectators demanded that Yang Hak fight properly because they had bet money on him and wanted to see a fair fight. He nodded and said he understood, but at the same time he wondered aloud how cruel they were for the sake of betting. Noticing that the tester was starting to undress, they were convinced of his serious attitude, and he, remaining in his pants and t-shirt, said that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. Seeing him undressed, Hyun-soo became alarmed, and the reason was not only his opponent's bulging muscles. His arms were disproportionately long, reaching almost to his knees, which looked particularly frightening. Staring calmly at the boy, Yang Hak asked mockingly if he had really been able to dodge so easily before. But what would he do now? He explained that his legs were not his strong point, but his arms were real weapons, and now he would show his strength. Loudly warning that he was coming again, he resolutely moved towards his opponent with the clear intention of attacking. Noticing the direction of the blow, Hyunsu, as before, tried to dodge, hoping to avoid a direct hit. However, the first blow with his hand reached its target, and the boy staggered, confused, and not understanding why his usual dodge had not worked. His opponent grinned broadly, loudly commenting that he would not be able to dodge now. At the same time, he was already raising his arm for the next blow, from which Hyunsu only managed to turn his head slightly to the side. But as soon as he turned, he noticed that his opponent's heavy and dangerous fist was rushing towards his head again. Defending himself, the novice began to block the blows with his arms, while Yanghak, smiling excitedly, beat him with enthusiasm, forcing him to retreat. Seeing that he was constantly backing away under the pressure of such an opponent, Irin became alarmed for the inexperienced member of her clan. Suddenly, Hyunsu accidentally touched the railing behind him with his hand and realized that he was standing on the edge of the roof. It turned out that his opponent knew this place in advance, had set a trap, and deliberately drove him here, and now he was celebrating by warming up his hands. Declaring that the young man had nowhere to run, Yanghak began to beat him fiercely with his heavy fists. Realizing that the main thing was to break out of this position, Hyunsu jumped to the side, but his opponent figured out the maneuver and blocked his path. Irin thought with annoyance that the newbie had ability, but his inexperience in real combat was too obvious. To take advantage of the narrow space and completely control the course of the fight, the tester drove him there. He deliberately narrowed the radius of possible movements, creating conditions that gave him overwhelming tactical superiority. Irin was at a loss as to how Hyunsu would get out of this trap, while the opponent, meanwhile, stopped to catch his breath with a malicious grin. Despite the pressure, the newcomer did not give up. He continued to cover his head with his hands, withstanding a barrage of merciless blows. Keeping his cool, he watched the tester closely, and suddenly a bright and fierce fire flashed in his eyes. The ensuing silence was suddenly broken by the loud slap of a blow, and someone in the crowd couldn't help but shout encouragement at the top of their lungs. The girl with pierced ears nervously clapped her hands and froze, her eyes widening with tension and unexpected fear. Irina, understanding the meaning of the sound she heard, waited tensely for the result, hoping for an important turning point. Seeing Yanghak lean back and throw his head back sharply, she was convinced that it was a successful counterattack by her young colleague. But the opponent quickly recovered, raised his arm again, and swung with all his might, intending to regain the advantage immediately. Grinning broadly, he was sure that the boy would not be able to dodge, as his fist was already just centimeters from its target, but it flew past One Frame's left ear, who lunged forward at the last moment, causing him to miss. The kid used a technique based on reading his opponent's attack, predicting its trajectory in advance. Diving under Yanghak's arm, he used his special counterattack move, putting all his strength into it and hitting the big guy right in the teeth. One spectator admired how the kid hit him. Another laughed and noted that the big guy got what he deserved. And a third even filmed the moment on his phone. Drops of blood splattered on the ground, and someone turned away saying they couldn't watch. But there were also enthusiastic shouts of "Wow!" Irritated and offended, the tester rudely called Hyunsu out, demanding an explanation for what he had just done. But the guy calmly and silently looked him in the eyes, putting his fists in front of him. His silence angered Yanghak, and cursing, he rushed forward, threatening to wipe the test subject off the face of the earth right then and there. Shouting, "Come on, one more time." He threw his left arm forward while preparing his right, and the guy dodged again with a turn. The provocative shout alerted Hyunsu, and noticing the bending arm, he did not dive under it, but thrust his right fist toward the attacker's head. When the man turned and attacked with his other hand, the newcomer sharply dodged and delivered a powerful counterpunch to the stomach. The crowd erupted in shouts, the spectators excitedly yelling and loudly commenting on the spectacle. Irin was amazed by the unexpected maneuvers of her clan member, who proved to be not as helpless as he might have seemed. Seeing his opponent turn sideways, Hyunsu anticipated what would happen next and quickly prepared himself. He saw that an attack with wide-ranging blows was coming and moved aside in time to avoid the collision. He understood that now Yanghak was not cornering him, but using long, sweeping movements, relying on strength and sharp movements. And so it happened. He turned and tilted his body, throwing his arms forward, but Hyunsu managed to avoid the blows. Then right at that moment, the perfect opportunity for a counterattack arose, and he struck him right in the head. Cursing loudly, the tester swung his right leg, nearly knocking the guy off his feet.